Hello? Oh, there we go. Sorry, all right, everybody. Thanks for coming. This is a topic I think we're all interested in because the mainstream media and the traditional media leaves a lot to be desired for a lot of people across the political spectrum. So today I've got some true all-stars in independent media to introduce to you guys. Up first, we've got Erick Erickson. He's the host of the nationally syndicated Erick Erickson radio show from Atlanta, Georgia. We've also got independent journalist Glenn Greenwald, the co-founder of The Intercept. And James O'Keefe, founder of Project Veritas. And finally, we've got Ben Swann, the founder of Sovereign. So those guys got way more applause than I did, so I'm going to let them do most of the talking. Let me just kick it to you first, Erick. Talk to us about your involvement with independent new media.
So a little bit different, I guess, from what a lot of people do is I've got a radio show that's syndicated, and I started it off small. And the way I funded it initially was because of advertiser boycotts from the left that have happened. I started a Substack, and 100% of the revenue actually went to fund and grow the radio show, which is now on 25 stations nationwide, including here in Las Vegas, out of Atlanta. And independent media, one, has largely made me uncancelable because I can depend on subscribers. There have been advertisers who have been pressured to drop the show and not advertise on the show, and it really doesn't matter to the degree that I can sustain myself with subscribers to Substack. But also, having worked for other websites in the past, having worked for other publishing companies, having been at Fox and with CNN, it gives me the flexibility to actually write about the things I'm interested in and to write on the schedule I want, as opposed to being pushed for deadlines by other people to cover stories that I don't care about, but apparently their click algorithm suggests must be pursued to generate traffic for them instead of me.
So Glenn, you're also on Substack, but you're also on Rumble, an alternative to YouTube, a competitor, free speech. Tell us what that's been like for you.
Yeah, I mean, when I left The Intercept in 2020, which was the media outlet I had co-founded in 2013 at the height of the Snowden reporting, I thought I was creating what would be kind of this spearhead of independent journalism, this, trying to kind of balance the ethos of an independent journalist with the benefits of a corporate, well-financed structure. And what I found ultimately was that those will inevitably become mutually exclusive. The corporate structure will always start eroding the sense of independence that you're trying to preserve. The institutional dynamics will always win out, in large part because when you're part of an institution, you start having, I think, even like subconscious allegiances to it that end up being a form of captivity that you don't really realize you're plagued by until you finally emancipate yourself from it. So when I left The Intercept with all the melodrama involved, I wasn't certain what was going to happen, and it turned out to be the best decision I ever made, in large part because the public has grown so distrustful, rightly so, obviously, of any media corporation that even if there's somebody who if you're someone they're inclined to trust, your mere association with a corporate structure, when they know that you have editors and people who are financing you who can have an influence on what you can and can't say, even if they're not exercising it, creates a kind of distrust. And finally freeing myself of that enabled me to grow my audience much larger than it ever was before, but also just feel much more empowered, much freer than I ever have been in terms of my writing. But I think more broadly, for me, and I talked about this last night in the speech I gave here, the growing repression of big tech censorship, which in reality is not big tech censorship, but it's really emanating from the government. They're being pressured and threatened constantly from outward, but then also inward from their millennial workforce. So it's kind of this bi-directional pressure, is a huge menace to the ability of the internet to be a platform where free ideas can flow. And so I've decided I'm only going to work with and devote my efforts to fortifying platforms devoted to free speech, and Rumble and Substack, for that matter, they're the real deal. They both have been tested. They've tried to do the kind of liberal activist tactics that Eric mentioned have been directed at his sponsors, and they both have resisted. And Rumble has grown so quickly. I don't know the exact numbers, but it's something like in the U.S., I think the audience of Rumble is close to 20% now of the audience of YouTube in the United States, and that's because there's a public clamoring for voices that they know are unconstrained. So I think this part of the media ecosystem is growing really rapidly, and what I try and do is only work with those platforms that are devoted to that.
So James, you've done something a little bit different than other folks on this panel, where you're doing the kind of undercover investigative reporting that traditional media outlets maybe used to do or never did, but you're filling that void there. What's it like operating in that space?
Well, we're a nonprofit organization, so we do we try to get incontrovertible video proof of things happening, whatever that costs. And our motto is that content is king. So we didn't try to be a platform or really have any viable economic model. I just wanted to go get the story and get the proof that it has happened, because in media today it's mostly circumstantial evidence and conjecture and opinionating and people on TV telling you what to think or what they think. And I think it's important to reveal things as they are, not to predict or to opine, but to simply expose. What's changed is that I think these days some people even in the comment section of our work say, we already know this is happening. I disagree with those people. I think that we're so divided on facts in this country still. We don't think that some people think that things happen, some people think that don't happen. An example of that is voter fraud. Even on the anecdotal level, people are almost religious in their belief that it either is or is not a thing. So investigative reporting is pretty much gone. ABC News, I think, got rid of their department. There just really isn't any investigative journalism anymore, and no business model for it, really. It's very expensive what we do. Extraordinarily. Some of our investigations cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to do, and the nonprofit model allows us to be fairly independent. No one tells me what to do. Quite unlike CNN, which is brought to you by Pfizer, brought to you by Pfizer, brought to you by Pfizer. No one does that to us. So that's allowed us some independence.
And Ben, in the social media space, when you're trying to provide an alternative to these established platforms, your Twitters, your Facebooks, your YouTubes, what it's like trying to compete when they're already huge?
Yeah, I mean, I on some levels, I kind of feel like the old man up here, which feels a little weird because I've been censored all the way back since 2012, 2013. And so we actually started building these platforms in 2017 when we saw it was coming. Even before a guy named Alex Jones, if you know who that is, was kicked off of YouTube, the first guy to be really kicked off that way. I was actually censored before him. And so what we realized was there was something coming to what Glenn was talking about, which is so important. Free speech and those ideas of creating these platforms is incredibly important. The problem is that free speech and censorship is a symptom of the actual problem. The actual problem is not censorship. It's not fact checkers. It's not content moderators. It's not the deplatforming. Those are all symptoms of the problem. The problem is you have about 3 or 4 companies that completely dominate and control the internet today. Amazon Web Services controls 33% of the entire internet. If you throw in Google and Microsoft along with that, you have 60% of the internet, controlled by 3 companies. And I don't mean the internet like a couple of websites or search engines. I mean the whole thing, cloud computing, everything. And so what we find is the only way you overcome that, if you want independent voices to exist, is you have to build outside of Silicon Valley. You have to flip their model on its head, and you have to move to something called decentralization, and that's what we have to do in media.
Yeah, and the traditional media has made it hostile for dissident voices or kind of dissenting from the center-left or further left perspective, but they've had the opposite effect. They thought they could just censor or ban these ideas out of existence, but it seems to really have prompted this intense interest and audience demand for independent or new media. So Eric, what do you think it is about the old system or the traditional media, especially with conservative talk radio, that led audiences to go to voices like you?
Well, you know, I had this interesting experience back in 2009. Fox and CNN were both wooing me, and Rush Limbaugh actually was a friend, and he urged me to go to CNN first and learn how to live in the lion's den before going to Fox, and eventually wound up there. But I went into Bill Shine's office at Fox when he was trying to convince me to come there, and he drew 2 circles along the coast Then he drew a little circle in the middle of North Carolina, and he said, you've got CNN and MSNBC. They compete for the coast. MSNBC has more, and he pointed towards North Carolina, so he gets college towns like Raleigh-Durham. And then Fox has everybody else. Fox pays attention to what happens within 100 miles of River Valley. CNN and MSNBC pay attention to what happens within 25 miles of the coast. But there's also an advertiser demand then for even a situation like Fox, where when you're in independent media and you have the support of people who trust you and trust your opinion, you're really relying on a subscriber base that is not under the pressure that they are. Even the coverage of the topics that a Fox or a CNN or an MSNBC will cover, they can't afford the depth and nuance that any of us on the stage can cover. In depth in an investigation, they don't have the bandwidth, they don't have the time, they don't have an audience with an attention span. And we benefit by having an audience that wants our stuff, likes our stuff, trusts our stuff, and actually does want the depth.
So Glenn, the idea of the traditional legacy media brand, the CNN, the MSNBC, and even to a lesser extent the Fox, right, their numbers aren't looking good. They're getting smaller and smaller, but somebody like Joe Rogan gets millions, he gets millions and millions of viewers, factors more than any of the major networks do on a given broadcast. Then people like yourself, you've got the Barry Weisses of the world, pulling in numbers on something like Substack that would make the Washington Post or the New York Times blush. So do you think that legacy media brands are dying and the future is going to be more about individual voices people trust?
Yeah, I think they're dying. I wish they were dying more quickly. But I think they're going in that direction. I think what's really happening in the corporate media is it's similar to what happened during in the pandemic to a lot of industries, which is almost every smaller entity died, and then the value of it all got consolidated into 2 or 3 giants. So I think the 3 leading media outlets in print, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, are growing and will be this incredibly strong voice. And pretty much every other part of the corporate media, these branches are just kind of decaying and dying and crumbling. And even those large institutions, the New York Times and the Washington Post in particular, though still quite large and profitable because of the brand that they've been building up, have much less influence for a variety of reasons, including the fact that the public just doesn't trust any longer what it is that they say. They lost their ability to just authoritatively decree to large numbers of people the truth and to be assumed to be telling the truth presumptively. And that is a very radical change. There's still a segment of the population that trusts them. The problem for them is they're very ideologically insulated. They're Democrats or they're liberals, and that's pretty much it. And so if you degrade yourself into essentially just being a partisan outlet and really losing the pretext of being anything else, you can be profitable, but you've lost the kind of stranglehold that you've had, this claim to speak for large segments of the population. And then when people distrust the institutions they were taught to respect, they obviously start to seek out alternatives. They first ask themselves, what is it that causes us to distrust these institutions, and what is it that we're seeking instead? And the thing that is so striking to me about, say, Joe Rogan and other people who are in the space, the part of the media ecosystem that's growing instead of dying, is it's very difficult to categorize him in terms of his fealty to a particular political party or even an ideology, which is, I think, how most Americans speak. You know, Joe Rogan in the 2020 election said, I really love Tulsi Gabbard. I kind of, like Bernie Sanders too, and I'm sort of interested in Trump. And outside of that, the rest of the candidates bore me. Now, to a media professional who thinks the entire world is understood through this traditional left-right prism, that makes absolutely no sense. Just like it makes no sense that there were, at least 10 million, probably more Americans who twice voted for Barack Obama and then voted for Donald Trump in 2016. But that's because how the media understands the world, the prism through which they interpret events, is not how most people interpret events. And most people interpret events the way Joe Rogan does, which is, I'm just someone who's curious. I want to know the truth. I feel like I'm being lied to. Sometimes I believe this side. Sometimes I believe that side. And I'm not going to pledge my loyalty to anyone and be in captivity to anybody. And so, what James was saying about what he tries to do, which is not persuade or convince or recruit, but just sort of to expose and let other people reach their own conclusions, I think that's the thing that it builds the most amount of trust. And that's what you're seeing more than anything else in this independent sphere.
So James, some of your videos have absolutely caught fire. I mean, stuff like the Planned Parenthood reporting that you guys done has changed the entire national debate. But I'm wondering, how do you figure out where the pulse is, what people are really caring about or want to know about, but that need isn't being met? How do you know where to look?
Well, to a certain extent, the sources find you if they trust you. I mean, I don't know exactly how Snowden came to you, but they probably came to Glenn Greenwald because they trusted Glenn Greenwald. So I don't know where the story is. The stories find us. That didn't used to be the case. We used to infiltrate, go undercover. But I think the broader issue is that the media tends to look at everything through a political lens now. And they tend to project, I mean, you wrote about this, Glenn. They tend to project that onto me. So they accuse me of that which they are guilty of. And everything is political. And what's most remarkable, another thing Glenn wrote about in this Substack, he wrote about this very issue, is that it's become almost like they, after the FBI raided me, there was this whole debate about who is a journalist. And the people that are doing the actual journalism, they go after those people the most. They'll target actual independent journalists. It's almost like there's a cartel, and they're trying to protect who is supposed to be a journalist. But journalism is an activity as much as it is a protected, priesthood class of individuals. I had prosecutors in New York. Prosecutors actually said this in my case. We're litigating this. Prosecutor in New York said, James O'Keefe is not a journalist, Your Honor, because he doesn't get consent from the people he records. Does the guy at NBC4 in Los Angeles get consent from the Jiffy Lube when he launches an investigation? These are absurd things to say. And these are coming, and by the way, there's no real distinction in my mind between federal prosecutors and New York Times national security reporters. They're one and the same. The prosecutors feed them, the administrative state agencies feed their buddies in corporate press information, but that's not journalism. Journalism is publishing what the powers that be don't want published, not just hand-delivering information on background. And when a source comes to me, I have to go out and corroborate. I have to challenge it. So these are all, but I think the greatest irony, Glenn, in what you're writing is what Glenn said is that they targeted Glenn. They called you an anti-surveillance activist.
Yeah.
And they call me a far-right attack activist. What does that even mean? And isn't all good investigative reporting activism insofar as you're adversarial? I mean, There are a lot of absurdities and ironies in this.
Adding one more thing to James, it was notable when the FBI situation happened, the number of blue-check journalists on Twitter who wanted to argue that the First Amendment doesn't really apply to you, the freedom of the press, because you're not the press. It always amazes me. And Glenn, I think you've pointed this out as well, the number of reporters who have, when these situations come up, feel like that section of the First Amendment belongs only to professional journalists, and because you're excluded, it doesn't apply.
I think it's a key point that it's this incredible misconception that's being promulgated on purpose by employees of media corporations who might have the job title in their HR file of journalists, but what they really are is employees of media corporations. They want to create this fiction that somehow there's a part of the Constitution that isn't for every American citizen, even though it says it is. This part of the Constitution is like this secret little part that applies only to people who earn the title journalist. And if you go back and look at how journalism was practiced and the freedom of the press, it was, the actual literal press, the printing press, which is what they were protecting. Most of the people who were using that to agitate against the crown were not journalists. That was not a profession. It was like they're like, here's a surgeon, here's a lawyer, here's a journalist. That didn't exist. Journalism, as James suggested, was something that citizens could use as a tool, just like freedom of speech, to agitate against those in power. It is an activity that's protected, available to everybody, and the idea that there's now this like cloistered license status that you need to prove that you belong to. And the other irony of it is, in some way, the irony is that the more stories you break of significance, somehow in their eyes, the less of a journalist you are. Right. Which is why if you ask most of these employees of media corporations, do they think Julian Assange should be in prison? They'll say, yeah, of course, he's not a journalist, even though they could live to be 5,000 years old and never get close to the number of significant stories he's broken. Right. And, the same is true with James, and there's an attempt to read me out of journalism as well, despite the stories I've done. So, it's kind of this inversion. It's the ultimate propaganda.
Well, and Ben, let me bring you in here. What role have the social media companies played in this gatekeeping effort? Because they're kind of a nexus.
Yeah.
These people who work at Twitter and the people who work at the New York Times, they come from the same slice of America, disproportionately liberal. They go to the same elite colleges. They have very similar worldviews. And then it becomes a question of who's a legitimate journalist or not in the eyes of big tech. Whether they're locking out the New York Post out of their Twitter account,
Sure.
whether they're giving some people blue checks and others suspensions. So what role is the big tech playing in that gatekeeping effort?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. Well, first of all, just going back to what Glenn was just saying about this protected class in the Constitution, and specifically freedom of the press. About 10 years ago, there was a lot of momentum behind this idea that freedom of the press is the only profession protected in the Constitution. It's not protected in the Constitution as a profession. It's protected as an activity. And so when you talk about like Thomas Paine writing Common Sense, right? He was not a professional journalist. He was a guy who wrote this pamphlet and handed it around as a rogue actor. He was what we are. He was an independent thinker who said, I'm challenging the status quo. And so it's not a protected profession. But what you do see happening is that really since the Obama administration was in power, there was a big push to kind of define a journalist as someone who works for a legacy media organization, right? So Dianne Feinstein years ago was pushing for some kind of federal distinction where government would create some kind of class to decide whether you were a journalist or not. And I think this was kind of at the height of the Assange WikiLeaks situation, right? Before he was in custody. And so the discussion was, how do we determine what a journalist is? And so government has to decide who is a journalist and who is not. Therefore, upon whom to bestow this authority to be able to report. But this self kind of feeding cycle that we're in, and somebody mentioned it up here a minute ago, I think we're continuing to live through this, right? Which is you have the big media corporations which deal with the bureaucratic state and they deal with government, and then government turns around and deals with social media, and then social media kind of has their dictates, and you have content moderators and no one really seems to know who they are. They're like these nameless, faceless, possibly teenagers somewhere in the world, or in some cases, living in third world countries who are sitting there and they're approving or disapproving content. And there's no accountability. Like Jordan Peterson, as you guys probably know, was just kicked off of Twitter. And one of his complaints is no one will tell him why he was kicked off, right? You need to apologize for the post you put up. He says, yeah, but you haven't told me what rule I broke. That's happened to me. That's happened to probably almost everyone on this stage at some point where you've been kicked off some form of social media platform. And you say, what did I do? And they won't tell you. Or they'll tell you what you've done wrong, and you have no position or ability to challenge that, right? So I remember I was kicked off of YouTube last year, and when I was removed, it was because I had posted CDC statistics regarding children and mask wearing. CDC statistics and the difficulties it was causing for kids who were learning. Well, YouTube says you violated our terms of service, we're kicking you off. And I responded to them and said, that's fine, but explain to me why citing government statistics gets me kicked off. But they don't respond. So there's an issue here with, again, big tech in collaboration with media, in collaboration with government, all these forces acting together. What's fascinating is they are ever shrinking in their influence, but it doesn't matter. Because, when people think CNN doesn't make any money, so at some point they're going to change their ways. No, they're not. They don't need to make money. Governments around the world pay CNN. They fund massive amounts of what CNN does. Or Pfizer, some pharmaceutical company that, by the way, isn't selling drugs directly to you, so they don't even need to do that. There's a faux apparatus in place that gives fake credence to authority in the form of legacy media right now.
And for some reason, CNN is on in every single airport I've ever been to.
Can I just say something about that? They're not anymore.
Oh, they're not?
Something's happening.
They canceled.
Have you noticed this?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. I was walking through the Atlanta airport. If you're in Atlanta, CNN, right, is supposed to be king there. And they have like some hokey made, girl sitting there with like a fake brick wall behind her talking about TikTok trends. And I was like, this isn't CNN, thank God. But it's not CNN. And it's pretty incredible. So something happened. So I guess that's a victory in and of itself.
So last discussion point here before we open it up for some Q&A. But I want to ask you guys, the flip side of being independent and not being attached to a legacy institution, not having to worry about advertisers or something like this, is that you report directly to your audience, your subscribers, your listeners, your viewers. How do you resist audience capture? Just, for example, Eric, I know you've said things that your audience really doesn't like when it comes to your views on Donald Trump or other people. How do you maintain your integrity and your consistency and your principles when ultimately, if your audience abandoned you, you'd be out of luck?
Yeah, you know, there have been times where I've had mass subscriber unsubscribes by pissing people off, but I piss everybody off. And once they get used to being mad at you all the time, they kind of settle down and just expect to be pissed off. In all honesty, there is, I mean, even in talk radio, for example, being a guy who didn't back Trump in 2016, and whether I thought he would have won or not, I didn't back him, but being able to find some level of common ground with my audience so they at least knew who I was. The downside, I think, to some degree of independent media as I see it and how I engage with it is being way more relational than someone in the mainstream media is, so they at least get a sense of who I am. So even if they disagree, they can kind of get a sense of why I think what I think. It's way more relational than what you would get from someone on TV who you really don't know. My audience has a real sense of who I am.
Glenn, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think every model has its downsides. If you're relying on corporations as advertisers, there's constraints and pressures not to report negatively on them. If you're relying on a single billionaire, as we did with The Intercept, you're subject to kind of the whims of a single person who might just pull the plug at any time. But this idea of being independent, but then relying on your readership has this kind of noble, romanticized aspect to it, but audience capture is very real. The idea that you have to be willing to alienate your own readership, otherwise you will quickly lose your integrity. And there are definitely people who profit greatly by just always feeding to their audience whatever ideological presuppositions they want to be validated. I remember the first time it really happened, it was 2010. I was only writing for a few years. I had not entirely, but a largely kind of left liberal audience at the time because I began writing in opposition to the Bush-Cheney war on terror and the civil liberties abuses of it, and it was perceived as left-wing, even though I never thought it was, but a lot of people did. And when Citizens United was decided by the Supreme Court by a 5-4 decision, it was pretty unanimous on anything kind of left of, like, say, Chuck Schumer, the center left, the establishment left, the actual left, that this was one of the most horrific, democracy-destroying decisions ever. For me as a constitutional lawyer, and particularly a free speech advocate, I saw it much differently. A lot of people forget that the ACLU weighed in on that case on the side of Citizens United, because the story that gave rise to that case was an advocacy group published a film that was critical of Hillary Clinton and was told they couldn't do that 45 days before an election. That was obviously an offensive act in terms of free speech. So I found the majority view in Citizens United the correct one, and my audience very much wanted to know what I had to say about Citizens United as a civil libertarian, as a lawyer, and I agreed with it. And I knew they were going to be enraged when they learned that I did. I think I delayed it a day, figuring out how I was going to do it, but I knew I was going to have to, and I bit the bullet, and I wrote an article explaining why I agreed with the majority ruling. It enraged them. I went back a couple of days later, engaged a lot of their arguments, explained again why I thought those arguments were invalid, and I adhered to it, and I knew that to this day a lot of people are angry about that. And I think what that did was it conditioned my audience to realize that when they come and read what I write, they should not have the expectation that they're going to agree with every word that I say. What they should have the expectation of is that I'm always going to tell them what it is that I actually believe. And I think it's a much better way of building trust with your audience. I think there are a lot of people out there who want that instead of people who are patronizing them or kind of calculating how it is that they think. There's huge numbers of people who basically are angry at the media, not because the media doesn't agree with their political position, but because they know the media is not being honest. Mm-hmm. And that honesty, that candor, the ability to people know that whatever it is that you're saying is your best effort to describe the world truthfully, I think there's no substitute for that.
And so, James, you, Project Veritas, you're a nonprofit, right? So this nonprofit media model has tons of upsides. You don't have to just chase clicks or advertisers, but you are ultimately accountable to your donors. How do you stay independent within that model?
Very easily, by just doing the right thing and not letting anyone influence you. And luckily, I'm the CEO and chairman of Project Veritas. We have some 100,000 people that support us. Freedom of association is critical to do journalism. It's part of the First Amendment. It's the same issue. I get sued a lot, and a lot of these people, what they want to do is find the names of our donors, which is the right to protect a donor is the same right to protect an anonymous source, the same principle. There was one time about 5 years ago, I did a story, and there's been ups and downs in my life, and there was this one moment when we got compromised looking into the Washington Post. We were investigating the Washington Post, and whenever we get burned, undercover person get burned, people jump to wild conclusions about our intent. That's what happens. So I had every blue checkmark journalist, I had Pulitzer Prize-winning reporters calling up every one of my donors, I guess in an attempt to, are you still going to support, James O'Keefe? And they called all these people. They couldn't really get anyone to back off, but I got one of our donors called me, writes a sizable check every year, and he said, I just got off the phone with the New York Times. A Pulitzer Prize-winning guy at the New York Times, James, is calling my cell phone, asking me if I'm going to keep supporting you. And he goes, now I'm going to give you 10 times more money. Because, damn, you must be effective if you have... But and notwithstanding the irony of where is the aggressive pit bull spirit? Why aren't they doing this to the FBI or the State Department? I mean, I had all these journalists calling these donors. But
how did they find them out?
Well, in 2014, one of our tax returns, which we gave to the state because we're 501c3, I had failed to redact the 990 Schedule B. That was an error. And they just had a field day, but nobody backed down, and that should tell you something. Other than that, I mean, in terms of audience, not liking us, I mean, I guess when I was arrested in 2010, there were people who say O'Keefe should have retired after the Acorn sting, and the 2017 WAPO. But the only other negative comments we get from audiences, they say O'Keefe should stop singing and dancing. To which I say, I will never stop dancing and singing.
So, Ben, how does this apply to the social media startup context?
Well, I think it applies in a couple ways. As a journalist, for me personally, what I have found over the years is, again, what Glenn said is true. If you're just consistent in what you do, your audience will appreciate it, and they'll come to recognize it. And while they may not agree with you, there's a point of trust that they reach, right? Where they look at you and say, listen, I may not agree with what you're saying, but I trust that you're being honest when you say it. And so we don't have to agree, as long as we can agree that we're both in pursuit of truth. In terms of the social space, look, what we're doing with the platform we're building, Sovereign, is that we're actually building it out as the first ever DAO. It's a DAO, Decentralized Autonomous Organization, which means that ultimately the social media users control and own the actual platform in the future. And so it creates what's called a hive mind. The more people that are involved in it, the larger it gets, the more power it has to be accountable to itself, the easier it is to find truth. By the way, if I can just say real quick, immediately after this, I'm in St. Thomas B, and I'll explain the whole thing to you. I'm speaking over there about the technological side of it, so I won't waste time with that here. But if you want to come see that, we're talking about it over there. And how you do that in terms of building out a technological response to big tech, but also giving the users the ability to have power and have the ability to control content and as well as control the platform itself, content moderation, all of it.
Great. All right, we're going to open it up to questions. Do we have somebody with a microphone? Yes. All right. You want to go here first? And folks, questions, not speeches, please.
James, thanks this morning for rescuing my 16-year-old grandson, putting him back in his pen where he belonged. I have a question for whoever makes the most sense to answer this. How do you guys explain the disparate treatment of Snowden, Assange, and Manning?
Pointing at me as the friend of all the lawbreakers and dissidents. I'm not really sure I agree with the premise, I guess. All three have had a quite difficult time, to put that very mildly. Snowden has been forced to remain in a country he never chose to be in, which is Russia, since 2013. So that's now 9 years in exile with his American wife and their 2 newborn infants. It's really kind of a whole fraud, that narrative, which is he was attempting to leave Russia from the first second that he got there. He was planning on flying through Russia to Latin America to seek asylum. The Obama administration, as they boasted in their books, trapped him there by revoking his passport and then bullying and threatening the Cubans to withdraw their promise of safe passage, preventing him from leaving. And now they use his presence there to try and impugn his loyalty, suggest that he was a Kremlin asset all along when he never intended to stay. But exile is a pretty harsh way to live, especially if you want to return home as he does. And if he did step an inch outside of Russia, they would immediately seize him and put him in prison. Prison, of course, is where Julian Assange has been for 3.5 years now in a very serious facility called Belmarsh, which the BBC refers to as Guantanamo, as the British Guantanamo. The U.S. is trying to extradite him to the United States and stand trial for espionage, where if convicted, he would spend the rest of his life in prison. Chelsea Manning was really treated really abusively for the first 1.5 or 2 years of her treatment. They didn't quite know what to do with her. She was kept in a cell in severe isolation. The UN ultimately found it was inhumane. She was then transferred to a military brig in the middle of Kansas, where she spent another 6 years in prison. So she did 8 years of hard time, at which point Obama commuted her sentence but didn't pardon her. So I suppose you could say on some level she got a little bit better treatment, although 8 years in prison is a serious punishment. Whereas the other two, the U.S. never quite got their hands on them and would like to. What really the U.S. security state does in all three of those cases, obviously Snowden and Manning, once they leak, have no more opportunity, no more ability to do any harm to anybody. They want to create a climate of fear so that anyone inside the government who's thinking about revealing secrets that are incriminating to the U.S. security state, to someone like James or myself or whoever, knows that if they do so, they have 3 examples to look at of people who have had their lives basically destroyed. And so they want people to think twice about it. And that's the real tactic. So, if you want to say Manning got a little bit of a better treatment, I guess you could say that. But at the same time, of the 3, she's the only one who really did her hard time in prison. They got to really destroy her over the course of that almost full decade. And so, I think the treatment of all 3 has been pretty severe.
We want to go to the next question?
Yes. How do you believe that your industry or profession will be different 5 to 10 years from now?
Why don't we run through all four?
I didn't get the last part.
question, though.
How will your industry be different 5 to 10 years from now?
Well, I think technology is going to change in ways we can't even understand. The directed ability to get content to the people who want it. Geo-targeting within independent journalism. If I'm writing something about Texas, making sure that the people in Texas have it immediately. I really do think technology is going to change, and I'm not a great prophet when it comes to these things, but the way technology is changing, the way it is decentralizing, I think fundamentally disrupts this in the way, to some degree, the internet disrupted traditional media.
Glenn?
Yeah, I agree with that, except that I would just add one kind of proviso that I think is important, which is I think there's an information war going on. Yeah. So as this part of the independent media is thriving, precisely because it's thriving, there's a serious attempt from the establishment to destroy it. I think it's hard to overstate how concerted these efforts are. I talked last night about this series of crises or manufactured crises that have been seized on, starting with Trump and Russiagate into January 6th, followed by the COVID pandemic and now the war in Ukraine. And each one of these crises has escalated the level of censorship over the internet that's being exerted. There are physical efforts to do that as well. I think one of the most important events was right after January 6th, when Trump was removed by a united group of billionaires from essentially the internet while he was the sitting elected Democratic president, was the emergence of Parler as the most popular app in the United States, because the argument was always, if you don't like how Twitter and Facebook are censoring, go create your own better alternative, which people heard and went and created Parler, and it was succeeding. Within 48 hours, Apple and Google removed them from their Play Store after Democratic politicians demanded it, and then Amazon removed them from hosting, and Parler basically got crippled, if not destroyed. That's what they're looking to do on a mass scale, is every time they identify a platform that is succeeding and thriving with this independence, they want to look for ways to undermine and subvert it, because they know that that is a real threat. So what the outcome will be 5 from 10 years from now depends on the outcome of this war, whether the journalism that's independent can insulate itself from those kinds of censorship attempts, or whether the government and their allies will succeed in destroying it.
5, 10 years from now, I think the images, which is often a staple of media, most powerful thing is image. Content will always be king, but more and more images will come from non-quote-unquote credentialed journalists. More and more will come from the inside, whistleblowers, and courage will become the real commodity over the image, because now images are everywhere, Instagram and TikTok, flooding your phone. And in 5 years, Project Veritas will be more powerful than the New York Times.
One follow-up. How will the kind of work that you do grapple with increased technology allowing people to make deep fakes or false images or videos? Because right now it's like video is king if that's your proof, right? But that could be different in the future.
There's always been an issue of plagiarism and the deep fake, even prior to the modern deep fake. I mean, I litigate constantly. Like, I feel like I'm a lawyer at this point. And I have, like, more lawyers than employees. My general counsel's waving at me. I've been deposed so many times. Project Veritas has been litigating defamation lawsuits. We recently won a historic victory against the New York Times in a defamation lawsuit. We're one of only, a handful of plaintiffs to do that since New York Times versus Sullivan. And in court, all of their BS they say on cable news just melts. Because when confronted with logic and reason, you can't lie under oath. You can't, when you're cross-examined, you impeach your credibility. So the deep fake thing, it still is a lie. There still is a truth. And the whistleblowers coming out, there's going to be so many of them. And just like Mr. Greenwald and Ed Snowden inspired, everyone that does that inspires another person to do that. And it may not have been the biggest story, but I think one of the most consequential stories this year. A whistleblower came to me from the FBI. A currently paid FBI agent gave me a document. And every time someone does that, it inspires another person to do that, until which time Project Veritas becomes more powerful than the New York Times.
So, Ben, what will social media look like in 10 years? Because I still remember 10 years ago, I had Vine.
Right. Well, if you think about it, 20 years ago, hardly anyone had Facebook. I mean, if you go back to 2004, 2005, Facebook was brand new. It was just launching. Almost no one knew what it was except college students, and now it's one of the most powerful forces on the planet. YouTube didn't really exist until the early 2000s, most powerful video service in the world, right? And they aren't just powerful, they're shaping and changing the entire global outlook. Look, right now, if you think Facebook is declining, what you may not know is that Facebook is the internet in Africa. Half the countries in the continent of Africa get free internet through Facebook. They don't access internet unless they go through Facebook. So what you have to understand about these companies is they're incredibly powerful. I agree that we are in an information war, but we're in an information war that will be won or lost based upon technology. And if we do not utilize the smart technology, look, 10 years ago, how many people in this room actually knew what Bitcoin was? Right? 10 years ago, a couple of you did. Good for you. I hope you still have it. A few of us did, right? I first learned about it in 2013. Very few people knew what it was. And whether you like it or don't like it, one thing you cannot deny about Bitcoin is that the blockchain has completely altered and changed what economic technology looks like. It has completely redefined banking, whether you're in favor of it or not. Doesn't really matter. Your opinion doesn't change the fact that Bitcoin and blockchain transformed economies. Now, we're watching the same possible revolution happen. So, 5 or 10 years from now, will Rumble exist? We'll see. Will Parler exist? It's trying to barely hang on. We'll see. Will Truth Social exist? We'll see. Will any of these up-and-comers, Getter exist, MeWe exist? I will tell you what will determine whether they will or not. is whether or not they adopt emerging technology. Because if they sit and wait for Apple and Google to get tired of them and delete them from the app stores, and they will, IBM to drop them from their clouds, and they will, AWS to do that, and they will, then we'll be sitting here 5 or 10 years from now with a bunch of new upstarts trying to figure out how to make them work. Instead, we need to embrace new technologies, build away from Silicon Valley, and really decentralize all of that power back to the people.
Hey, Brad. I actually want to ask Glenn something related to this with this information war. Substack, you and I are both on it. It's great, very pro-freedom. At the same time, the financial processor is Stripe, which is in the past, some of the people there have questioned whether or not they should work with various people. We see how financial institutions target gun manufacturers and the like. I'd actually really be interested in your take on that Achilles heel for the pro-First Amendment free speech crowd.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we need to think about is exactly that, which is, so you take a platform like Rumble, and the people who work at Rumble who founded it may be very devoted to free speech. They are. But they rely on a whole bunch of other service providers of all kinds of origins that can really pressure them, if not force them to, say, for example, stop hosting RT or other pro-Russian voices. And that's the same. That's going to be the same for Substack. And so I totally agree that the key is to create this kind of ideological infrastructure that makes these sites less reliant upon and less vulnerable, all these kinds of vulnerabilities, so that technologically there's a system that nobody can penetrate. So you can no longer find these vulnerabilities where you're going to Stripe and saying, well, Substack won't kick off this transphobic commentator, whoever I think should be silenced, but you, Stripe, have the power. Why are you processing and enabling their payments? Okay, then Stripe's now suddenly pressured. Or maybe there's a cloud service that Substack uses that then and I think that creating that infrastructure, as you've been saying, is the key to preserving the ability for this to continue.
And by the way, Stripe is already doing that. There is a whole series of different entities and companies that Stripe will no longer process for. And by the way, we've already fixed that problem at Sovereign, by the way. I'm at 210. I was over in St. Thomas B. You can hear all about the technology. I'm telling you, we've already figured this thing out. And we're going to get you guys to all come over, too. Because, listen, it's not about what we're doing. And Rumble and all these other entities, we're actually not trying to keep them from it. We are hoping all the existing companies that are out there will start adopting this same technology. Because it's decentralized, it doesn't flow through Ben Swann. It doesn't flow through one person. It flows through a web of different experiences. And so it can't be taken down. I mean, that's how you fix the problem.
All right, can we get a round of applause for the panelists?